Hello, my friends. Welcome to episode 160 of Stand Up. Joining me today, historian Kenneth C. Davis to talk about the 75th anniversary of the two nuclear bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Also joining me today, CNBC's Ron Insana to talk about the state of the economy. Well, and you. I'm Pete Dominick. Time to stand up with me right now. Well, hello and welcome to day 1295 of our long national nightmare with our game show host, president, who doesn't care about anybody but himself. There are 89 days left until Election Day, and the president is doing everything he can to create a smokescreen, confusion around all of it leading up to the election. So each day matters. Stay close, pay attention. And I appreciate you listening to this podcast where each and every day I'll bring on experts that are going to help us understand all of these important issues. Yesterday, the president insisted that the coronavirus again will just go away like things go away. That's what he said. He said, we'll go away like things go away. He didn't even have anything to compare it to because nothing that he ever does seems to go away. Anyway, negotiations on a new coronavirus relief bill are still deadlocked. Paying close attention to what happens with that. The State Department's acting inspector general resigned less than 3 months after replacing the inspector general that the president fired in May. That's an insane story that everybody should be paying attention to as well. And finally, Trump campaign sued the state of Nevada over its plan to send absentee ballots to all active voters this November. Can they do that? Is that going to be effective? 158 deaths in the United States of America as a result of coronavirus. I'm sure it's much higher than that. And the president, of course, just says, it is what it is. It is what it is. This is the United States of America. Slurring his words. Something is wrong with that guy, for sure. Well, a lot of things are. Let's get to some polling numbers. How about that? 58% of Americans say the U.S., quote, should allow voters to vote by mail in elections this year to help slow the spread of the coronavirus. 31% said the U.S. should not allow all voters to vote by mail in elections this year because it jeopardizes election security. I wonder why people think that. I wonder what could possibly make people think that. Perhaps it's the repetitive notion from our president and his pundits and right-wing media. Here's another poll number. 66% of voters oppose delaying the presidential election due to the coronavirus pandemic, and 54% think Trump floated the idea of postponing to help himself get reelected, according to Reuters. And one final poll, this one from Politico. 14% of voters said they would take a coronavirus vaccine if Trump recommended it. 43% said they'd take a vaccine based on the advice of Dr. Anthony Fauci of the CDC. And the CDC recommended 43%, or their family, 46%. So who do you trust? Is it Peter Navarro, who was on CNN for some reason? They got to stop inviting that asshole on, who is constantly trying to sell and promote hydroxychloroquine. No, I don't think we should be trusting him on it either. He's an economist and a bad one at that. And also a piece of shit. Trump's a piece of shit, and so are all the people that are working for him. I mean, how do you see it any other way? I'd love to hear from you if you do, and maybe we can argue about it. 3 defense officials at the Defense Department have contradicted President Trump's claim that the horrific explosion in Beirut, Lebanon was a, quote, attack. The defense officials said they didn't know what Donald Trump was talking about. Also, Lebanese officials have not called the explosion an attack. An estimated 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate stored in a warehouse in the port of Beirut exploded, and we still don't know that it was an attack, but the president is saying it anyway, which is insanely irresponsible. How do we make it to Election Day? How do we make it through the next year? I'll tell you how. Together. That's how. We got to keep supporting each other. We got to stay together. We got to network and stay close. Tonight at 8 p.m., if you're a paid subscriber to this podcast, if you have a subscription, you can join me and a whole bunch of other people, 8 p.m. tonight, and we will work on it together. We'll talk, we'll commiserate, we'll laugh. It'll be fun. So if you're not signed up, then do it now. Go to patreon.com/Pete Dominick. And if you are, I look forward to seeing you. If you've never been there, you ought to join us. It'll be fun. We'll be there for about an hour. And you know where else I'll be Saturday night? Royersford, Pennsylvania, doing live stand-up comedy for the first time since the quarantine and the pandemic began. And I would love to see you at that gig. If you're in or around that area, come on out Saturday night. All right. Lots more to get to with my guests and lots more guests to get to this week. But today, Ron Insana is coming up. But before that, we get a history lesson from my friend and favorite historian, Kenneth C. Davis, because today, ladies and gentlemen, is the 75th anniversary of the only time any country has purposely used a nuclear weapon on another country. Of course, that is ours, the United States of America, dropping 2 nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, August 6th and then August 9th. And I think it's a really important discussion to have because I think the people who lived through it we're infants and children now, and there's not going to be many of them left in Japan. And we don't want to ever see this again. And it's terrifying how many nuclear weapons we have and how much more powerful they were even than these 2 weapons. These 2 bombings killed between 129,000 and 226,000 people, most of whom were civilians. And the argument persists as to whether or not we needed to do that. I say no. What will the professor of history say? The great Kenneth C. Davis joins me. Don'tKnowMuch.com. Go get his books. Follow him on Twitter. Here's our conversation. So I have my favorite history professor and author joining me right now. As I told you all about him just before, always excited when I get the opportunity to talk to him. And today is a very, very important history in world history. You could argue the month, really, but it is the 75th anniversary of the United States government military dropping 2 atomic bombs on 2 Japanese cities. First, this day, 75 years ago, Hiroshima, where 140,000 people were killed instantly or within months later. And then 2 days later, 80,000 people were killed, estimated to have died in the bomb dropped in Nagasaki. But, Professor, thank you first for joining me. I just don't know how far back we start on today's lesson.
Well, it's a really extraordinary day, Pete, in history. I am of the generation that grew up having to go down to the basement of my elementary school for those duck and cover drills that you probably only saw in funny old movies, documentaries.
Yeah, I was the generation that only had to do with fire drills, the generation between duck and cover and active shooter.
That's right, in lockdowns for active shooter, right. So we did have those 2 generations, and I was of the former. So I do remember very clearly, and I grew up just outside of New York City in a small town called Mount Vernon, New York, and we were marched down. We actually didn't do duck and cover. We actually stood facing the brick wall in the basement of the school, which had one of those big air raid drill signs on it. And if you are of a certain age, you know what I'm talking about. If not, this is all kind of weird baby boomer nostalgia, but it wasn't nostalgia because it was a serious issue, especially as we got into the 1960s. And somebody's starting a motorcycle outside. I don't know if you're picking that up.
Kenneth Davis in his New York City apartment. No, it's fine. Go ahead.
Okay. So I can close the window and we can continue without that in the background.
I want you to be comfortable. I don't think folks care too much about that.
The point is that this whole nuclear age, the atomic age, really begins, in a sense, on this day, August 6th, 1945, when the United States drops the first atomic bomb used in war on the city of Hiroshima. It was a city that did have some military importance, but it was also a city of several 100,000 civilians. Of course, the mushroom cloud, we all see that in our minds, the image of that cloud, the incredible firestorm that was created, and then the radiation, which began to affect some people immediately. And it's interesting because I've read histories that show that some of the men who designed these bombs and some of the men who made the decisions to drop them understood that people were going to be killed right away because this had an enormous explosive power, many, many times the power of the biggest bomb used in World War II. But they didn't really understand what radiation was going to mean. Some certainly did, but not everyone did. And so the horrors of radiation continued for the survivors of Hiroshima for many, many years, of course. Some died instantly, some died within months, some died years later, and of course from cancers and other side effects of the radiation released by an atomic bomb. But the buildup to August 6th and the days that follow it are really part of one of the most extraordinary months in world history 75 years ago. Right. And I've been running a kind of day-by-day blog of this on my website, don'tknowmuch.com. And it really starts on August 16th, 1945, when they test the atomic bomb in the New Mexico desert. They didn't really know if it would work, and it did. And Harry Truman, who had become president on April 12th, 1945, about 2 months earlier, had not known about the atomic bomb as vice president. It was that closely held a secret. He was only learned about it after he became president when Franklin Roosevelt died. And he's at a meeting, a post-war meeting, because the war in Europe has ended. Germany is defeated in May. Truman goes to Potsdam, city just outside of Berlin, to meet with Winston Churchill, the prime minister.
Famous conference, right?
This is a conference in defeated Germany, smoldering, ruined Germany. Berlin has been practically leveled by the Red Army, which was the army that entered Berlin and defeated the Nazis in Berlin. So it was just weeks after this extraordinary moment of May 8th, which we celebrated this year as 75th anniversary of VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. So Truman goes to this meeting and he meets Churchill, who he'd met before, but he also meets for the first time, the day after the bomb test, Joseph Stalin, the supreme master of the Soviet Union and one of the most brutal, vicious dictators in human history. And Truman records his first meeting with Stalin. And he says, I can do this. I can do business with this guy. It's one of those. So it's just an extraordinary moment in human history. One side piece to this story, incredibly dramatic. You probably remember the scene in Jaws where the captain of the Orca describes the night that he's in the water with the men of the USS Indianapolis, and he shows his scar. The US Indianapolis, if you remember from the movie, and this was not a fiction that was made for Jaws, this is true. The US Indianapolis was the boat that carried the components of the atomic bomb from San Francisco to an island in the Pacific where the planes were waiting. After it delivers the bomb components, the USS Indianapolis is torpedoed by a Japanese submarine. And because of its secret mission, nobody knows it's out there. Nobody knows for 4 days that the ship has gone down. 1,200 men go down with it. Finally, 4 days later...
It's not allowed to put out a distress call because it's a top secret mission.
They couldn't put out a distress call, and then the ship sank in 12 minutes. It's a riveting.
And many of the men died in a shark. Sharks killed them, and hence
shark-infested waters. That's right. They think of the 1,200 men on the boat, about 800 were actually in the water surviving. 300, a little more than 300, were pulled out 4 days later. God. It's a chilling story. So all of these,
had the Japanese found the Indianapolis and torpedoed it on its way there, it would have been a different history.
It would certainly would have been a very, very different history, of course, and just an amazing human side of the story, this story of, we talk about history in terms of dates and battles and proclamations, but this is the human side of what war was like.
Yeah, one of the important things I've read is that, the Japanese public people are concerned that because 75 years have passed and those survivors were infants or small children at the time, that that people will forget. And I want to take this moment to just talk about and get the kind of, not boilerplate, more specific to this event, why history is important, because we don't want to repeat it. And the fact, the other thing to tie in is just how prolific nuclear weapons have become in this world, and yet they were only used in August of 1945, 75 years ago. There have been close calls in terms of accidents and obviously the Cuban Missile Crisis. But why is history important to remember what happened today, 75 years ago in Japan?
Well, there are two things about it that I think are really important to remember. First of all is to understand how incredibly damaging, life-threatening, how extreme the use of atomic weapons are. And both of these devices, Little Boy, which is the code name for the Hiroshima bomb, and Fat Man, which was the code name for the bomb that was used on Nagasaki 3 days later on August 6th, a different type of bomb. One used uranium and one used plutonium. I won't get into the physics of that, what that means, but the plutonium bomb was actually even more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb was. So the devastating effects of these bombs and the long range effects and the moral, ethical questions, even if we want to talk about the idea of just war, of using these weapons, is something that we still have to contend with as historians, as human beings. And so that's one reason, certainly, to understand the history. You had really hundreds of thousands of people ultimately die in both of these bombings. And by the way, there had been just traditional sort of fire bombings of cities in Japan, like Tokyo, earlier in the war, that were almost as costly in terms of human life.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Really important, not only, as you mentioned, Japan, but Dresden in Germany. And I was prepping to interview you here, and I learned that there was a point when the American leadership, obviously before we got into the war, was critical of the kind of mass indiscriminate bombing of civilians and harshly critical of it, including FDR. Apparently, I read some quotes. But once we got into the war, that seemed to have changed. And I think the reason you're mentioning the firebombing is because it was as bad or even worse in some ways than the atomic bombs in terms of the kind of death that people suffered, and specifically the targets.
Yes, it's horrific. And these were civilian casualties. And we like to, try and think about growing up more recently in the era of so-called smart bombs and video controlled bombs, and watching them, in the Gulf War first and then in the war with Iraq, where they could, pinpoint a bomb or a cruise missile going down a specific spot or taking out one particular Jeep. But of course, there are always extraordinary civilian casualties in war. And this was perhaps the most explicit and grievous example of it, because of the nature of radiation being part of this. It wasn't just the explosion or a fire. It was the long-term effects on people over decades. But there's another part when you ask the question of why do we understand the history? Certainly, we want to understand the horror of war, and certainly how we must avoid the use of these weapons. And again, the weapons used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki are a fraction of the killing power of most of the nuclear weapons that several countries around the world have today.
Yeah, that's so crazy.
In massive numbers. I mean, this is, we have the ability to destroy the world many, many times over. And, for much of the past 75 years, since the beginning of the atomic age, we kind of had a basic trust in the people who were in charge. And I can't say that many people would feel we have that same trust today. And I'm not being glib about this. It's a serious question.
People can say I'll be glib about it, but I firmly believe that if there were a cruise missile headed to a blue state city, Trump might look the other way because he's an absolute sociopath. But that's my commentary, not yours.
But
all right,
we won't go there. I won't go there.
I went
right
there.
now.
You won't go there. I went there on your time, and I apologize for it. But that's what I mean. He's letting people die in blue states of the coronavirus.
It is a serious question. You know, the enormous power that one man does have, and the relatively few controls on it is one of the other questions that we have to ask about this. And then the ultimate question that people have been asking really for 75 years is, was it necessary?
Yeah.
Did we have to drop these bombs on Japan? The argument goes, and I am the child of World War II veterans. My father did not serve in the Pacific. He served in Europe. But my uncles served in the Pacific. I knew I had other family members serve in the Pacific. And I can tell you that those guys will tell you they were really fine with the decision to drop the bomb. The argument was that if the United States had to actually invade Japan, that it would have cost hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. It would have been enormous. The Japanese promised on July 29th, I believe it was, 1945, that they were going to fight to the end. And the experience that American soldiers and British soldiers the Allies had had in fighting the Japanese on all these notorious islands in the Pacific, Okinawa, Iwo Jima, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, horrific battles where the Japanese really did seem to be willing to die for their emperor. We know about the kamikaze planes, the suicide bomber planes, where Japanese pilots just dove their airplanes into American Navy vessels to try and destroy them. So that was part of the mindset that the American government and Harry Truman and the military leadership was looking at. So when people told him, look, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people will die if we have to invade Japan and take it, and it takes a long time to do it, that was part of the consideration. So the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, and then 3 days later, a second bomb. Those decisions had been made in advance. It wasn't like, oh, let's wait and see what happens 3 days later. And then, so the process had already been set in motion. Well, here's another. Go ahead.
Well, wasn't there was a test in July where we successfully detonated the first A-bomb at a test site in the desert in New Mexico. Then wasn't there a warning to the Japanese that we've got this weapon and we're prepared to use it on you, so give up?
There was a general warning in that same conference that I mentioned earlier. Again, this is an extraordinary period in world history where the events came one after another. On July 26th, Truman issues what is known as the Potsdam Declaration. He issues it with Great Britain and with China, which was an ally at that time, the Republic of China, led by Chiang Kai-shek. And it called for Japan's immediate unconditional surrender, and it threatened destruction without saying what that threat would be. This was still a carefully kept secret. Truman actually told Stalin that we have a weapon of extraordinary power and destructive power 2 days before that. Stalin said, well, how interesting, because Stalin knew already about the atomic bomb. He did? Yes, because
Who told Stalin?
Well, Stalin had spies in the Manhattan Project.
Wow.
This is the story of the Rosenbergs and Klaus Fuchs.
Okay, right.
There were atomic spies who had gotten this information to the Soviet Union. So Stalin knew completely about Stalin knew more about the Manhattan Project than Truman did.
Really? That's not really?
Oh, absolutely.
They kept the secret from the president. That's how confidential it was. FDR.
While he was vice president.
Right,
they kept the secret from him while he was vice president.
All right.
And
wow.
One of the reasons, again, this all ties together, and I actually write about this in one of my earlier books, The Hidden History of America at War. The real rush for the Soviets to get to Berlin first was that they knew that that's where the Germans were developing the atomic bomb, and they had fissionable material in one of the German laboratories, and they had all these German scientists, and they wanted to get their hands on them, and they did. So Russia, Soviet Union, goes into Berlin early in May and takes out atomic scientists, and they don't find the uranium. It had been stashed away. So this is an incredible story of all of this going on in the background to what we think of as, World War II going on and tanks and men fighting. This is what's going on behind the scenes. It's all really fascinating stuff. And Stalin, as I said, knows all about the Manhattan Project because of his spy network.
Was after the first bomb was dropped in Nagasaki this day?
On Hiroshima.
Forgive
August
me.
6th.
August 6th. In 1945, 75 years ago today, did Truman say, do you give up now? Before he dropped another bomb 2 days later on Nagasaki.
There was no additional threat. And as I said, the decision to drop the second bomb had already been made. And they also knew, because there was no direct contact, obviously, between the Japanese and the United States, they didn't know that the Japanese were trying to negotiate something with the Soviet Union, because Stalin had stayed out of the war with Japan while he was completely allied with the United States and Great Britain and France. When it came to fighting the Nazis, he had nothing to do with fighting Japan. Although he had also agreed secretly in May or earlier, I should say, that he would declare war on Japan 3 months after the war in Europe ended. And that would have been August 8th. And that's exactly what happened. Russia declares war. They send 1 million troops into Manchuria, part of China, the Greater China, which was then Japanese-held territory. And this is the other part of the big picture of the use of atomic weapons in 1945. The United States was aware that the Soviet Union was going to be the next threat. They had been our ally throughout the war.
Right.
They had really, in many ways, defeated Hitler. We like to think of, D-Day, and all those battles are incredibly important on the Western Front. But the Russian role, the Soviet role in defeating Hitler has really been overshadowed for a lot of people.
Yeah, I've been watching some documentaries about that recently for some strange reason.
The loss of life in the fighting between the Germans, the Nazis, and the Soviet Union was extraordinary. We're talking about tens of millions of soldiers.
It was like 20 million.
Civilians. Yes.
Something like that? Unbelievable. Yes. Unbelievable. So go ahead.
My point is here that there was the next war had already begun in a way. At Potsdam, just as they had earlier in the war while FDR is still alive, at another conference called Yalta, they were starting to divide up Europe between the West and the East. And what happens at Potsdam is that Stalin really comes away in control of most of Eastern Europe, and it will become part of the Soviet Empire for the next nearly 50 years. So this is an extraordinary moment going forward. And that's why it's important to think, well, was there another reason to drop those bombs besides winning the war against Japan? Part of it was they wanted the war to end quickly so Stalin would not be able to take too much territory from Japan that they held in Asia. And part of it was also to say to Stalin, we have these weapons and we are willing to use them. And so the Soviet Union did not yet have atomic weapons.
Where is that stated? Like the idea that the United States of America wanted the world to know we've got these weapons, you don't yet, and we're willing to use them, so don't screw with us. Like, is that?
It's not written anywhere. This is really more in the way of historical putting the pieces of the puzzle
interpretation.
Together. Yes, it gets a little bit into more into interpretation. So there's no document in Harry Truman's diaries or papers or State Department papers that say, let's show the Soviets what we have. It's not like that. But it's apparent that this was in a sense, a shot across the bow, if you will.
As a bit of a sidebar, you wrote a great book about American presidents, which it's probably, I don't know how to say which of your books is my favorite. That's not possible, but don't know much about the American presidents is fantastic. Is it fair to say that American presidents write in their diaries for purposes of prosperity, or to say it another way, they kind of lie or embellish on purpose, knowing that history is going to read these diaries?
That's a really good and interesting question. Part of it is it a diary or is it a memoir? Truman really did keep diaries.
Yeah.
And he wrote letters to his wife. So we have a lot of things that do reflect his thinking at the time. So when he writes in his diaries, for instance, about the decision to drop the bombs, and it's clearly one that he states in his diaries is one about winning the war so we don't have to invade Japan. If you just take Truman's word for it, that was the reason. But we have other people who, even contemporary people, even people within the orbit of Truman who disagreed. His chief of staff, a man named William Leahy, and anyone who wants to dig into this a little bit more, it's all on my website, don'tknowmuch.com. It's called A Month That Changed the World. William Leahy said the Japanese were defeated. We did not have to use these barbarous weapons. Dwight D. Eisenhower was opposed to the use of the atomic weapons against Japan. He had no say in the matter. I'm sure they listened to him, but he had no say in what was happening in the Pacific War. As president, he was given the option of using a small atomic weapon once against the Vietnamese to help the French while the French were fighting the Vietnamese before the United States got into that war. And he said, absolutely not. We can't bomb these people, for a second time in 10 years. So
we later bombed the shit out of Southeast Asia for years.
That's true under Johnson and Nixon. That's very true. This was Eisenhower's decision before the United States actually had any direct involvement in the war. This was attempting to save the French, for whom Vietnam was still a colony. The French fought against the Vietnamese for a long time before the United States got involved in fighting in Vietnam.
So do historians...
And all this history has to always be seen as linked together.
It does, for sure. All of it does. It's a really good point. But are historians still arguing about the necessity of dropping the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in order to end the war? And how do historians break down on that based on kind of what country they come from?
I can't speak about what country in terms of other countries. I think it
just feels like American schools, American students are still learning one kind of history. Certainly I did.
But there are a lot of American historians who take a very different approach, and certainly historians more to the left or progressive or maybe even the Howard Zinn school of history, which is, a pretty left of center school of history, would absolutely take the approach that this had much less to do with winning the war against Japan than it did about
showing her power,
having the first real shots fired in the Cold War, which was the war that followed World War II.
right?
And then we have just to play this out, because we've talked about it a lot, this extraordinary month. So the 6th, we get this horrific bombing in Hiroshima. And anyone who has never read John Hersey's book, which was actually a magazine article in the New Yorker published in 1946, called simply Hiroshima, should do themselves a favor. It's one of the great pieces of narrative journalism in history. Read that book to get an understanding. He looks at what happened from the perspective of 6 survivors. It's a riveting piece of journalism and a piece of history. 3 days later, the other bomb is dropped on Nagasaki. On the 14th in the U.S., it is already the 15th in Japan. Japan announces it will unconditionally surrender. And Truman gets to stand up and say, everything we've been fighting for since Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, the day of infamy, we've gotten. The fascism is dead around the world. We wish it were so.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting proclamation to say, and obviously 75 years later, looking at how powerful the nuclear weapons are, how pervasive nuclear weapons are, and how fascism is doing its best to make a strong comeback. I think that's why it's so important to talk to you and to learn about history, especially today, the 75th anniversary of the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima.
And just to put a final point on this, Pete, as soon as that news went out and it was flashed around the world and around the country, of course, in those days they used to have a ticker that went up in Times Square that flashed the news. Now they show basically the stock prices, but then they had a real news ticker go up, and of course they announced the war. If you want to look at the opposite of social distancing, look at the crowds in Times Square on victory over Japan Day, August 14th. They say 2 million people were in Times Square, and they didn't leave. They partied. The famous picture of a sailor kissing a nurse. Yeah. There are actually 2 pictures. One was on Life magazine by Eisenstadt. That was taken on VJ Day in Times Square. People were deliriously happy. This long, brutal, very, very costly war was over. It had cost many, many American lives, of course, and severely tested the country in some very, very dark hours 75 to 80 years ago. So it's important to look back at how we have come through some incredibly dark moments in our past. And certainly December 7th, 1941 was one of them.
There's some more August events that we need to talk about. I hope we can do that real soon. I appreciate your time so much, sir.
It is always a pleasure to talk to you. As I said, if you want to dig a little deeper on some of this, don'tknowmuch.com is the website. I talk about this in several of my books. Don't Know Much About History, obviously. It's something that I talk about and Don't Know Much About the Presidents in terms of Truman. There's a chapter about the World War II in the Hidden History of America at War. So I've been writing about this and thinking about it for a long time, and it's really important stuff that we shouldn't allow to forget just because that greatest generation is quickly disappearing.
I'll have all those links in the show notes for today's podcast in case you can't remember them, but I highly recommend you go get all of Ken's books and put them in your personal library, don'tknowmuch.com. And also, if you're doing any kind of Skype learning, distance learning, Ken is great at that too. So hire him to come into your school or organization or what have you. Thank you so much, sir. I really appreciate it as always.
Thank you, Pete. It's great to talk to you, and we'll do it again down the road.
All right, there he goes. Kenneth C. Davis on Twitter, don'tknowmuch.com. Go get the books. Get them for a gift for your friends. Hire Ken to join your school, your organization. Everybody's trying to figure out ways to homeschool. he is a great idea right there. Tell him Pete Dominic sent you, and definitely give him a follow. And what else can I tell you? Oh, I love that guy. We're going to be talking, I think, again at the end of next week, getting a preview in the history of the political conventions, which are going to be obviously virtually this year. The president said maybe he's going to accept the Republican nomination at the White House, but Nancy Pelosi said he can't do that. So that'll be fun to watch play out. Ugh. All right, now joining me to talk about where we're at in the economy, what industries are winning, what industries are losing, and get his forecast. He's a great financial analyst. He's a public speaker. You see him often on CNBC. Great guy, really smart guy, and I always love talking to Ron Insana. You got to follow him on Twitter. Tell him I said hello, and here he is, my conversation with Ron Insana about the economy. I'm recording. What are you wearing?
Wouldn't you like to know? I am unshaven. I'm in a black T-shirt, pair of tan shorts. I don't know, the equivalent of something like topsiders.
You look like an extra from The Sopranos.
Yeah, and I'm only about a half hour away from where they shot that. Shot everybody, actually.
What happened to you with it was crazy yesterday, this hurricane?
Yeah, it was nuts. I mean, we had a couple of moments where probably the gusts were 50, 60 miles an hour. Put one of our trees on our next door neighbor's roof. Pool looks like a pond. Knocked out the power. The generator's broken. So, I'm charging my phone in the car.
Forgive my assumption that the great Ron Insana has some kind of a bomb shelter or silo that he and his family have been into with all kinds of digital equipment ready to broadcast.
We have no safe room whatsoever.
And what about your relationship with your neighbor before your tree fell on their tree? That could be a tough thing to negotiate with.
He was perfectly kind. He came over, had a mask on, knocked on the door. The tree, and it's the side of the house that I don't visit that regularly for whatever reason. There's just this little walkway on the side, but it's on the opposite side of the driveway. And I didn't even notice this tree happened to be roped to other trees. And so somebody had an issue with it before we were here. And it was just leaning on his house. And so we got to take care of this morning. So,
well, I'm glad you and everybody is okay. But
yeah, we're fine. Listen, my youngest daughter's got mono. My son went out to LA a week ago to produce a hip hop and R&B album, and we had to have him check for corona. Let's see what else we got going on. I don't know. My daughter graduated college in December, was in a job in January, got promoted by 6 weeks in, and furloughed within 4 months. So it's been a blast.
What industry?
Talent agency.
Yeah, there's.
Everybody's getting crushed. There's no production in LA, no production in New York.
Do you look at the economy now or even before now in terms of the industries that are doing well and kind of the aggregate? Because I find myself fascinated and really curious about and sometimes surprised by the industries that are thriving in the pandemic and then those that are completely destroyed permanently. Can you even have a kind of a conversation about general industry-wide destruction?
Yeah, and it's a rough one to have because it involves so many people. This is where the complaint about the stock market has come down recently, that, the market's going to new all-time highs, and there's some big companies like Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Netflix, Google that have done, Microsoft that have all done very well. And not only have they survived the pandemic, they are thriving because they're providing services that either you used before to a lesser extent and now need every day, or because this is what the future looks like. So the market's rewarding those. Then you look at retail, you look at airlines, you look at, anything that is high touch, consumer, casinos, gaming, whatever, anything that restaurants, those businesses are getting decimated. And we just saw two more bankruptcies in retail this week, Men's Warehouse and Lord & Taylor's parent company. So, what I've heard from industry experts and technologists is that everything they expected to happen in the next 3 to 5 years is happening effectively in 3 to 5 months.
I've heard that a lot of the things have gotten sped up as a result of the pandemic. But I feel like, do you ever, because given your knowledge and your connections and your work, do you ever I mean, how much do you panic? You don't seem like a guy who panics, but can you look at an industry and be like, oh my gosh, if the demise of that industry or that economy,
like my own.
Well,
I mean, look, my speaking business is down 50% at least this year, right? I mean, so
investment business, you said?
No, speaking.
Oh, speaking. Yes, right.
I'm not going anywhere, right? I mean, you know, and I'm doing some virtual work, but yeah, I mean, I'm getting a little too old to panic because I bought extra insurance. So if anything really goes wrong, family will be fine. But yeah, I get panicky once in a while. But there was a time that I was in a dead panic, and it was during the financial crisis of 2008 and 9, because I thought the banking system was going to fail both at home and abroad, and that it was soup line time. And thankfully, it never materialized that way. This may be in some ways more profound, not just because of the health consequences and whether or not we get our arms around the biologic shock, but it is radically reshaping the economy. And there may be a lot of people who are permanently displaced in the absence of education and retraining. And I think while I don't panic and I panic less for myself, maybe that's inappropriate, but I am worried that the country is not prepared for this rapid of a transition, and it's going to be jarring for a whole number, millions and millions of people.
Do you see, in a perfect world with good leadership and less divisiveness, do you see this disruption potentially being positive in terms of what kind of adaptive qualities it creates? In terms of, I would go as far as saying, rebuilding our economy to live our lives in a somewhat different way.
So believe it or not, I could not sell that book, which I pitched.
Oh, really?
So I wrote it as a column for CNBC instead, because no one wanted to take a risk on anything linked to the pandemic, which it really wasn't. I'd been thinking about this for a long time. And so I tried to sell the title, Rebuilding America, Restoring Prosperity in a Post-Pandemic World. What the pandemic has done has laid bare all the problems that we have, whether they're social, institutional, or logistical from an infrastructure perspective, and makes it very clear what we need to do in terms of restoring faith in institutions, fixing not just roads and bridges, but really rethinking the infrastructure of this company. So I'm sitting in my car right now because it's got a running battery, because I still got power lines from 1905 in New Jersey when Thomas Edison was putting them up that are getting hit by, winds and trees and branches. Everybody else buries their power lines. We don't need telephone lines anymore. We're all on cell phones. We haven't even rethought what the process of new infrastructure would look like. So I tried to pitch this idea, and I didn't want it hooked around the pandemic. So I even rewrote the title and all that kind of nonsense. But yeah, this is if it's not, it's one of two things. And I think it may be binary. Either it's the moment we grapple with all these issues and truly start to tackle them for the next wave of whatever this country's supposed to be, or this could be a turning point where we simply just see our living standards get lowered over time, the way other great nations or empires have gone into decline.
I am an optimist and a positive person, but I tend to see the latter because I see the disunity and the division, which has been growing, I think, in this country, certainly in our lifetimes. I'll put you and I in the same generation, Ron. I'll be very generous to you.
Roughly, yes, thank you. I appreciate that.
1975. But
1961.
Okay, well, maybe we should just end the conversation. We can relate to nothing.
I'm biologically capable of being your father.
Let's see if we can cross this divide by asking you, were you familiar with the cartoon character Yosemite Sam at any point?
Absolutely. Are you kidding me?
Let's move along.
Those are from the 1940s.
So given the disunity and the division, I mean, I feel like you are uniquely capable to talk about this, especially with me, because so much of it is driven by media. If we're going to restore faith in institutions, how do we restore faith in a media that is rewarded by big ratings? And you get big ratings by being entertaining in one way or another. And the way that seems to do...
Which I think is putting it generously, by the way. Yeah.
How would you put it? And you know the question I'm driving at.
Listen, I mean, I think, non-fact-based, misinformation, opinion-driven media is killing us. And I think that it's very hard, whether you're on the right or the left, and if it's someone who doesn't have a full grasp of any particular topic. I mean, you may be an expert in one, but most of us were, even in my business, trained to be somewhat broad generalists because at the end of the day, everything affected the market. So we had to learn a lot about politics, geopolitics, industrial policy, all this kind of stuff, trade, globalization. But if you're not well versed in this, and if you come from a perspective that isn't grounded in whether it's science, whether it's fact, whether it's reality in some cases, you get a following, you amass a following of people whom you influence and ultimately force or guide to make wrong decisions, like mask wearing. I mean, the simplest thing in the world. This should not be political by any stretch of the imagination. The fact that people fight this as an abridgment of freedom when you're still wearing a seatbelt, when you've got a motorcycle helmet, when it's illegal to smoke, indoors in most cities now, it was done for your health and your survival. And that's what this is being, suggested or demanded for. And people are fighting it, and it's going to kill them. And it's just stupid. And honestly, I don't know what the catalytic moment is that's going to unite us. 9/11 didn't do it. This isn't doing it. So I don't know, short of an invasion by, one of the red armies, whether it's China or Russia, how we get our minds around uniting as a country again.
I don't know that would work either. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, because the problem seems to be, if we were to get off media for a second, the problem seems to be a lack of understanding about history or interest in the worthiness of democracy. It's not that we're arguing about economic policy or health policy or an environmental policy. We're arguing about whether or not we want to live in a democracy. Actually, we're not arguing about it. I think the Trump side doesn't really recognize that as being under threat, or arguably maybe doesn't recognize it as being valuable. Or if you want to take the most pernicious take, they don't like democracy. They want authoritarian rule.
Well, look, I think, if you want to be, again, if you'd like to be generous in a certain sense, the Trump organization itself had one person at the top, had, a lot of people underneath, had a few competent lawyers and some other people that allowed him to prosper in some manner or another. And he's just transposed that onto the federal government without a real respect for the institutions that drive progress and the institutions that secure freedoms. And so I think to that end, I've never loved the comparisons to a Hitler or a Stalin. In a certain sense, you could see some similarities with Mussolini, who wasn't a genocidal maniac, but really did like control. He was still a very bad guy, and Trump doesn't compare in that regard. But these guys who think that autocracy is a good thing, or, single man rule is a good thing, seems to resonate with him. And I think threatens the form of democracy that we've enjoyed. Now, whether over the long run this becomes more participatory, we get rid of the electoral college, we have direct, one person, one vote type democracy at the federal level, it will be interesting to see. Otherwise, again, like you say, the more pernicious side of this is that we collapse under our own weight. And sadly, given that we're running up our bills rather, heftily, and we're doing some other things that may be, from a foreign policy perspective, somewhat unwise, it might take a while to get out of this. I don't think there's any, flashpoint that suddenly triggers an immediate change. It's going to take some work.
That's for sure. It's going to take some work, and it's going to be quite a gamble. How do you see the economy right now as we're talking in the end of, August 2020 going into 2021? What are some of the trends that you see, and how much of it depends on the government response, the negotiations that are currently playing out right now?
Well, the idea that we're even having a negotiation about whether or not to support people with enhanced unemployment benefits after they've run out is, absurd on its face. I suspect they'll get a deal. I suspect they're going to cut the size of those benefits from $600 a week to $400. There might be other strings attached as to, who's eligible. But look, at the end of the day, we're already starting to see the economy slow down after, a 2.5 month rebound. Some of the layoffs are becoming permanent rather than just furloughs. And I've always been in the camp that suggested that this was going to be a W type of recovery, or it's going to be a double dip type recession. And we're starting to see the numbers, turn a little bit lower, the real time indicators that we're getting. And when you look at retail not able to find its footing, even among, some of the stronger companies that are bricks and mortar. Now, you have to exclude Walmart and Costco and Target, which have very vibrant online sites and then also have done a very good job about maintaining the safety of both their employees and their customers in the stores. But you look at the fact that restaurants, small mom and pops, of which there are hundreds of thousands in the country, it's been estimated that 1/3 of New York City's small businesses are permanently gone. So I don't see how we have a full-fledged recovery that everybody's talking about or many people are talking about unless we get a bulletproof therapeutic that, again, takes serious illness, hospitalization, and death off the table, or a vaccine comes through that we get sometime before the end of the year. I mean, because we're going to struggle between now and then. And then it's kind of, off to the races. But we have to take the risk away for people to get on planes or to, really start commingling again. And what you're seeing is, you're seeing mobs of the not terribly bright people, whether it's on the Jersey Shore, whether it's out in Southern California, whether it's the beaches of Florida or other places, having these massive parties at home on the beach with hundreds of people, no social distancing, no masks, and you're seeing spikes all over the country. So that's going to slow things down. My bet on school is each school will be open for about 2 weeks. It's going to be a couple of kids and a couple of teachers, and everybody's going home. It's a cynical way and a kind of a pessimistic way of looking at it, but we've already seen it happen. We saw it happen in Israel, and we're starting to see it happen in some places around the country where, a kid gets it, and then the teacher gets it, and then teachers are going to say, I'm at risk. I'm not coming in.
Do you even see room for debate and conversation about school in places where there is no active virus, in some rural Maine or Vermont, or even where I live now in upstate New York, where it seems to be gone, at least for the time being?
Yeah, I think so. But again, that also requires additional funding from either the federal or state governments. And as you know, New York State doesn't have the money. So it would be from the federal government to, one, deliver more personal protective equipment, to have sufficient and rapid testing and contact tracing, and 3, restructure the classrooms and the facilities so that you can maintain a social distance, even if it appears that the virus is gone, because people are still coming in and out of town. New York City now is putting up checkpoints at the bridges and tunnels for people coming in and out of the city, based on license plate and locale. They've pushed the transmission rate down to nearly one, which is relatively low. They don't want to go back up. So I just worry that even where there are areas of low transmission right now, if everybody relaxes enough, it'll rear its ugly head. And we're seeing that in the Midwest right now, where a place where everybody thought it was not even an issue, it's suddenly become an issue.
Well, you mentioned the cost of opening, and the cost for a gym or the necessity of a gym to reopen is, not necessarily comparable or as important as the cost of a school and I mean, we are as a society trying to decide, I suppose, what is essential, but most people, it's not a controversy to talk about schools reopening, including colleges, but mainly K through 12. And I think what people are missing is how expensive it is to reopen safely and responsible. So the president can scream all the time, reopen, but the real conversation has to be the cost of reopening, because you can't just reopen and have things return to, quote, normal with the big class sizes and not socially distancing and everybody in school at once, not to mention what happens in the cafeteria and on and on and on. It costs millions of dollars to reopen. Where does that money come from? That's the conversation that is not apparently as interesting at the national level, but it's happening at the Board of Education at the local level in every district in America. How do we afford to reopen?
Every teachers union is talking about it. And look, I think within the relief package that's being discussed, there is money that's earmarked for schools, but we don't know if it'll be enough. And honestly, going back to my childhood, I could easily skip gym without too much too many tears.
You just pissed off a whole cohort of phys ed teachers. Just lost.
Yeah, well, I can tell you some stories about my gym experiences when I was a kid in upstate New York that still boggle my mind. So
they destroyed and define you. That they are the reason you're Ron Insana, aren't they?
Dude, I'll give you this example because we have a page on Facebook where we talk about it. So I grew up in a suburb of Buffalo, New York, and so I started school in 1966 in kindergarten. By 7th grade, because it was Buffalo, New York, if you did any swimming, it was done indoors. So we had a pool, and this was true of my older brother, who's 5.5 years ahead of me. The boys swam naked in the pool.
This is a school at a school. You didn't have an indoor pool at your home, did you?
No. Oh. No. I lived in Cheektowaga, New York.
All right. Well, I
barely had a home in
kind
my home.
Of a home. Okay, so you're at the indoor pool, and
we had an above ground pool when I was about 10 years old.
Well, there's nothing wrong with that, sir. I am the king of the above ground pool, and I highly recommend it. But
I learned how to swim in that thing.
So you're in 7th grade. You're in the indoor pool at school, and you're naked with other boys. Yeah, I've been there.
Okay, but so we're swimming and playing water polo and diving with no bathing suits, and they told us that the fibers from a swimsuit would clog the filter of the pool. What? They also had these wooden boogie boards that had holes in them, and if you did anything wrong, they would bend you over, dip them in water, and give you a massive smack that would show for days. And both my brother and I, and we have this whole page on Facebook, if you grew up in upstate or Western New York, dedicated to this. This went on from like the 1950s to the mid-1980s. And when we brought it up over dinner, my brother and I were in our 30s, and my mother said at the time, "Why didn't you tell me?" It's like, we thought nothing of it. Everyone in town was doing it, and no one said anything about it. So
what's the name of that Facebook page?
Well, it's probably, Cheektowaga, New York, and then Maryville, Ucrest system. All of us who went through schools in Buffalo, and in fact, a friend of mine who grew up in Long Island went through the same experience.
Now, your phys ed teacher was Jerry Sandusky, I'm reading here, according to
well,
Wikipedia.
In retrospect, we think that there was something wrong with this whole experience. Thankfully, I never got hit, but I'll tell you, diving wasn't much fun.
Jesus, diving into a pool naked and just off
a board. It wasn't just, you weren't just diving; you're diving off a board. So if you didn't know what you were doing, belly flop would be a polite way to put it.
Oh God, scrotum flop. Rough.
I'll let you use the.
I don't think I've ever dived off of anything naked. I don't think I have. I don't think I would. It sounds unsafe.
No, it was, and listen, there were other forms of torture. So you could do. I'm trying to think how we got it.
You're saying back to schools. We could do without phys ed and the torture that it is for some young people. Yeah. No doubt about it. Getting picked to last in gym classes. Sometimes it either you end up in jail or a kingpin. But either way, there's a lot that happens there. So your point is about adaptation of formal and traditional education. And by the way, talk about disruption. There's been efforts to reform our education in any number of ways, progressive, conservative, we can argue about them, but this forces us to adapt everything in our life, including education. But how do you do it if it's going to cost so much?
Well, it may cost less at the end of this is true with healthcare. When you think about telemedicine, it's true when you think about education and distance learning, and that technology from a cost perspective is probably the answer, not the problem. Yes, the rollout of virtual classrooms was probably horrible. My kids went through it this past spring. My son, who graduated high school, finished in March, and that was it. They did some online stuff. Right. Wasn't terribly helpful, but everybody had been accepted to college, so they were kind of done anyway. My youngest, who's going to be a senior, had to do a full semester, and she had to really plow into it. It was rough, and it wasn't as effective, and probably it wasn't a great educational experience sitting at the dining room table with a computer in front of you, trying to interact with classmates. But you think about bringing down the cost of college in particular, where general education classes that, where you're paying $65,000 a year, $50,000 a year to go into a room with 300 kids, all that stuff could easily be done online. And you could knock the cost down for the first 2 years before you get into your major. There could be all kinds of adjustments made. I've talked to people in telemedicine right now, and a friend of mine who's an ENT, he can get all the, he can order a CT scan, he can get it, and then, interact with that many more patients during the day if he doesn't have office time, if he's just doing it on a computer. Yeah. So I think at the end of the day, we're going to find creative solutions. Those things may not happen as quickly as me doing, a TV shot from my home office.
A lot more to talk with you about. I got to run, and I appreciate your time today. As always,
my pleasure.
We got to talk more often.
I got air conditioning in my car, so
enjoy. He's just sitting there in his t-shirt and docksiders with the AC. It's hot out. Good luck, kid. I hope they get the power back soon. All you guys, millions of people lost power. Natural disasters and a pandemic. That's another conversation. Ron Insana, always a pleasure. Thank you.
Same here, man. Thanks, Pete.
Really one of the nicest guys. So many nice people out there. So many good people. Most people are good. That's what I believe. Do you believe that? Do you agree with that? Hey, I hope to see a lot of you good people tonight at 8 p.m. If you're listening to this on Thursday the 6th, there is a Zoom link. You got to be a paid subscriber to the podcast, which I do every day. If you're not, please sign up. I love hearing from listeners. I love getting to know you. And I'm behind, like I said, all week. I'm buried. I'm trying to get this studio built, which made a lot of progress. Well, made some progress on it this week, and I plan to get it painted and spackled and taped and sanded on Sunday. And we're making good progress. I'm very excited about being out there in the middle of the yard. It sounds crazy, but it's a dream come true to be working in that space and to be doing what I love. Thank you so much for supporting it, for learning with me and laughing with me. Whenever you get the opportunity to listen to the podcast, please reach out to your friends. Tell them about it. Tell them to subscribe to the Stand Up with Pete Dominick podcast, wherever podcasts are available. Saturday night, I'll be in Royersford, Pennsylvania, doing the first stand-up comedy since the quarantine began. I hope that if you live in that area, you can come out and see that show. And I am out of time for today's episode. Thanks for spending some time with me. I'll talk to you tomorrow with Christian Finnegan and nature writer David Gessner, and maybe some more. We'll see. Talk to you then. Be the change you want to see in the world. Know that you're not alone. I love you. I hope to see you tonight at the Zoom. Zoom? At the Zoom? Who says that? I guess I just did.